Hello, my name is Matt Rooney and I am Engineering Policy Advisor at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers. Today we're going to talk about the coronavirus pandemic and in particular its effect on global greenhouse gas emissions. I'm joined by Dr. Simon Evans from the climate change and energy policy website Carbon Brief, who has done some analysis on this. Simon, thank you very much for doing this. And I'd like to begin where the pandemic begins in China. So looking at China, what effect has the pandemic and the lockdown had?
Yeah, so we published some analysis back in mid-February looking at what was going on in China as a result of their coronavirus response. And basically we drew on a number of indicators, so things like daily electricity generation at coal-fired power stations, activity at the ports that handle coal imports to the country, output from oil refineries and steel plants and so on. And we estimated based on those indicators that there had been a 25% reduction in CO2 emissions from China over the course of about 4 weeks. That slowly tailed off as activity started to return towards normal, although it remains even now below sort of usual levels. And overall, something like 250 million tons of CO2 reduction just in a 7-week period, which is pretty significant.
Yeah, and obviously the pandemic then moved on to other countries. The coronavirus spread and lockdowns have moved on to other countries. So what other regions have you looked at and what has been the effect?
Yeah, so I mean, pretty much as soon as we published that analysis, we started thinking about whether we could replicate it and whether we could look globally or at the UK, the EU, or other regions. And we found actually it's quite hard to get good close to real-time data that you can use to estimate CO2 emissions. A lot of data is published, weeks or even months in arrears. And in contrast, economic activity tends to be tracked much more closely and much closer to real time. So it's quite challenging, and a lot of the indicators that are out there weren't necessarily sort of compatible with making estimates of CO2 emissions. Nevertheless, what we did over time was to build up a picture based on a number of different sources and forecasts from third-party organizations. And so we were looking at things like what's happening in the EU carbon market, what's expected to happen in the US this year, how's electricity demand changing in India, and a relatively consistent picture emerged that those countries with lockdowns in place were seeing really significant reductions in transport use in particular, but also in electricity demand and therefore emissions.
And in terms of the sectors, were you able to separate them out? I mean, obviously transport has been affected, but in terms of industry and other sectors, were you able to separate that data out?
So I think it's fair to say that the sorts of estimates that we were basing our analysis on are, they're not necessarily based on detailed sectoral information. So, I think, to be honest, it's mainly kind of inference, but obviously transport is the one that's been hardest hit. And that's reflected in the forecasts we're seeing for oil demand this month, down almost a third, according to the International Energy Agency, and more than 9% over the course of this year. Obviously planes are grounded, people aren't driving their cars and so on. Other sectors obviously being impacted by this. Electricity is a big one. Because offices and factories are closed in countries with lockdowns, we're seeing reductions in demand of 10 to 20% in, much of the EU, the US, parts of the US, and also India. Countries also including places like Turkey as well, unexpected places perhaps. But, all of those things are contributing to the reduction in CO2 emissions.
Yeah, and your article includes attempts to project the future in terms of what the total emissions drop from 2019 to 2020 might be. What sort of estimates are you getting and how are these estimates been produced?
Yeah, so we built up a bunch of different bits of information from different sources. So, for example, the global oil sector forecast from the International Energy Agency and so on. And building all of those together in a way that they don't overlap we estimated emissions this year would fall by of the order of 2,000 million tons of CO2, and that's roughly 5.5% of global emissions. I should say that we actually revised that figure up from 1,600 million tons, which is 4%, in the space of a week, simply because new information came to light, new and a better forecast based on more recent information. So it's a really uncertain and fast changing situation, and I wouldn't be surprised if we end up having to revise that estimate again.
If your estimates are approximately correct, even, what would be the historical scale of this emissions reduction? Is it comparable to anything in history?
I mean, this is going to be easily by a long distance the biggest ever reduction in annual carbon emissions. The previous biggest is less than half the size of the sort of impact that we're expecting this year. So in that sense, not only is this crisis unprecedented, but also the resulting drop in emissions is also equally unprecedented. And I guess it's worth thinking about in terms of historical precedents, what happens next, what comes afterwards. And certainly after the global financial crisis, for example, there was at the time, historically unprecedented increase in emissions the following year after a reduction in 2008, as countries around the world rushed to kind of stimulate their economies, pumping billions or trillions of dollars of investment into carbon intensive industries and infrastructure. So that certainly could happen in the years that follow. I guess it seems clear that the coronavirus crisis is going to be much more prolonged and uncertain compared to previous crises we've seen. Okay,
well, thank you very much for joining us, Simon, and I look forward to reading all of your analysis on Carbon Brief. Thank you all for watching, and if you would like to read Simon's article, we'll provide a link to it below this video. Thank you very much.